Hi guys, hold on for a second. Before we proceed to the video, I have something very important to tell you. Professor Jon V Kofas has published his new book in collaboration with Little French Media, and the title of the book is Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Authoritarianism. This book details how neoliberalism impacts the geopolitical economy in the 21st century. You can buy it from Amazon, and the link is in the description. Thank you. Now let's proceed to the video.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is a session on the Manhattan Project and its legacy and impact on contemporary civilization. It's only a coincidence that I'm doing this session just a few hours before there was a strike by Israel on Iran, and presumably, according at least to some sources in Tehran, on a nuclear facility in Iran. The fact is that regardless of this specific incident, the reality is that the Manhattan Project, which unleashed many advancements, as we'll see briefly from an overview, in science and technology in modern civilization, it also has contributed to humanity living in fear of nuclear winter. In other words, the end of life on our planet. This is not to suggest that at any time soon, one hopes obviously, that we will have a nuclear war. However, there are here we are in the last week of October 2024, and there are two concurrent wars, one in Ukraine, the other started by Israel in retaliation to Hamas on October 7th, 2023, taking some hostages, and that became a war of genocide according to the ICC and ICJ, the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. And now that war from Gaza has expanded to Lebanon, to include Lebanon, and just a few hours ago, obviously, Iran. Again, this is not to be alarmist or to argue that this is Armageddon or anything of that sort at all. However, there is the reality that, according to some published reports, Israel does have an estimated 30 nuclear warheads. It is the only nuclear power in the Middle East. There are only 9 countries in the world that have nuclear weapons. Israel is one of them. There is speculation that Iran may have. I have seen no solid evidence. It's on its way of building and so forth and so on. They maintain they do not. They can if they wanted to, but they prefer not to, and we'll leave that debate aside. The larger issue for us is the legacy of the Manhattan Project on human civilization. Civilization is not built on mass destruction, and nuclear weapons are designed, if they're used, for mass destruction. And if the ultimate outcome, if the ultimate war takes place, I should say, the outcome would be mass destruction on a world scale, and possibly the end of life, at least life as we know it. So this is a very, very important topic. There have been many, many books, articles, journal articles in newspapers, debates, and so forth, videos, and what have you, including motion pictures, by the way, and documentaries about the Manhattan Project, and especially about the leading figure, the so-called father of the atomic bomb, namely Robert Oppenheimer. There was one movie back in the 1980s with, I believe, Paul Newman was in that one. And there was another one just recently, year, 2 years ago. Um, so this is a topic of global interest, and it remains so precisely because of the two wars that we have, where the threat of a nuclear holocaust is there. Now, having said this, let me begin by noting that the Norwegian Nobel Prize Committee this year awarded the prize for peace, the Nobel Prize for Peace, to a Japanese anti-nuclear um, group. The name is Nihon Hindakyo, and this organization spokesman held a press conference, thanked the Nobel Committee for the Peace Prize, and of course drew some parallels between Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, when the US dropped two bombs on those two respective cities in Japan, and what is happening in Gaza, namely the children and the women, as well as the men, eliminated en masse. This is not to argue that there has been nuclear weapons. There have been nuclear weapons used, obviously not. There has been some chemical warfare, including phosphorus. I believe the Israelis used phosphorus, which is a very deadly chemical. So white phosphorus is a very deadly chemical to be used, and they have used it, according to sources, in any case. So we have a situation where the Nobel Prize Committee deemed the threat of nuclear confrontation serious enough, considering, by the way, that both Russia and China have red lines. Russia has said that it will use nuclear weapons. And by the way, just for the record, of the 13,000, roughly 13,000 warheads that are known in existence in the world, they have 5,500, somewhere in there, 500, 5,554, something like that. That's the most in the world, with the US coming in second, around 5,000. Now, that's more firepower than required to blow up the planet, by the way. So we are living in dangerous times. This, again, this is not to sound alarmist. However, it is to bring attention to a very serious issue, namely the survival of the planet, and the fact that accidents are also possible. And there have been instances, by the way, especially in the 1950s, but also in the 1980s, where there were misunderstandings, and there was the possibility of going the next step, namely pushing the button. So this is a very important issue. What I want to do today is go through, from an overview perspective. I'm a historian. In fact, years ago, I did teach a course on the history of the nuclear arms race. I want to go over this because, in the context of what is happening today, and because the division of the world between the US-led NATO G7 group and its allies versus the China-Russia BRICS group. And in fact, both sides just held meetings, respectively, the BRICS group in Kazan, Russia, just this week, actually, and the other group, the IMF World Bank in Washington, D.C. So there is this division of blocks again, as though we're back in the Cold War years of the East West confrontation, as scholars called it. Now, let me point out that there are people who argue that nuclear weapons are not to be feared because they're made not to be used except for one thing. They have been used. The fact is, the United States did use, not once but twice, the atomic bomb in Japan, against Japan, in August 1945. We'll get into very briefly into that, what the decision-making process on the part of President Harry Truman and his advisors on how to use the bomb. Now, let's look at where, how historically the world came to develop a bomb. One could argue, and there have been arguments on this topic, that, well, human beings, the atomic bomb, nuclear weapons are actually in the mind of scientists, in the mind of physicists and engineers. True enough, that's true. That's where it all starts. It all starts here in the human mind. And the question is, what do you do with the advancements in science and technology? Do you apply it to create a better society, have a better world for all human beings, by the way, not just for very few, but for all human beings, or toward mass destruction? Um, Paradoxically, and it is indeed a paradox, this is an area where, in fact, um, the Manhattan Project has had positive contributions. Its legacy does have positive contributions in everything from nuclear medicine to agriculture, to water purification, photography, space exploration. There are a lot of areas where, in fact, the legacy has had a positive impact in the civilian sector, contributing to a better world for humanity. That's all true. However, there's the other side, namely the reality that we have had a world ever since, not ever since the Manhattan Project, but ever since 1949, when the US lost the monopoly of nuclear power status, because there was a second country in 1949, summer to fall 1949, that announced the successful testing of an atomic weapon, namely the Soviet Union. Okay, so what we have is, after that, the race to build the bigger, better bomb. Um, an issue, by the way, which the great American film director Stanley Kubrick, who, disillusioned with the way things were going during the Cold War in the US, left and went to Britain, and did, in fact, make a film about the absurdity of nuclear weapons and the nuclear arms race, a film that is a dark comedy called Dr. Strangelove. Now, in 1938, the background to the Manhattan Project is actually Germany, And many of the people who were behind the project, some of the most brilliant scientists, were in fact European Jews and American Jews. Robert Oppenheimer was himself in that category. All of this starts in 1938 when Albert Einstein and a Hungarian physicist who had won actually the Nobel Prize, I believe in 1932, he won the Nobel Prize for physics. His name is Leo Szilard, um, learned that there were two German scientists who had successfully tested the fission process in atom explosion. So what happened is immediately they decided, in consultation with some of their colleagues, that this information is very important, must be passed on to the United States government. Now, 1938, by the way, was the year that the Third Reich under Adolf Hitler annexed Austria. They didn't call it annexation. The fact Hitler was Austrian, by the way. It was called in German Anschluss, which means the unification of Germany and Austria. And so they became one entity. And then, of course, Hitler and the Third Reich, um, uh, Reich ministers had their eyes set on moving east toward Eastern Europe, Poland and Eastern Europe, hitting obviously Russia as part of Hitler's um, core goal in his foreign policy, called in German Lebensraum, which means living space. That is taking the land of other people who are already there. Obviously, you have to eliminate them, push them aside, do something with them. That means going to war to take their land, all the way up to Siberia, because Hitler wanted a hegemonic Germany, a dream of those who came up with the concept of Lebensraum ever since the late 19th century, the late 1890s, early 20th century. Now, when FDR received, obviously, Einstein, Albert Einstein was the leading physicist. He was well respected. Um, when he received the letter from these two both European Jewish physicists, Leo Szilard and Albert Einstein, he wanted above all to make sure that this project that he was in fact going to undertake, if the Germans were going to build a bomb, it meant the end of that they would in fact have realized the dream of Lebensraum, and it would mean upsetting the European balance of power and the world balance of power. Obviously, the U.S. would not have that. The U.S. wanted to do everything to prevent that. And then there was the question, of course, what happens with their ally, namely Japan, under Emperor Hirohito. So what concerned the United States was that the other side not develop this weapon. Uh, Secrecy was of the utmost concern for and rightly so, for the administration. They did by 1940, I think July 1940, something like that. They did hand over the administration of the project, to lay the groundwork for it, to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in Manhattan, in New York. That's why it's called the Manhattan Project, by the way. And they began to kick around some ideas about who should be included, who should head the project. And obviously, they knew this was going to be very costly, okay, to develop an atomic weapon. It was going to be very costly. And the other thing is that they wanted to make sure that from the people involved, and eventually there were a lot of people involved, very few would know the ultimate goal of what this project was, namely an atomic bomb. The decision by 1942 there was a decision to appoint Robert Oppenheimer. Robert Oppenheimer, by the way, is regarded as one of the most intelligent people of the 20th century, a brilliant physicist, a man who proved extraordinarily gifted in every domain of academic endeavors, um, from linguistics to philosophy, to religion, actually. He was fascinated by Hinduism, for example. Um, so he led this group. Now, among the people, of course, you would think, since after all, as I stated, Albert Einstein was, along with Leo Szilard, these were the two people who informed the FDR group, the administration. Leo Szilard was actually included because of his expertise in developing, and in fact, that's what he was assigned. And he was put in charge of developing the nuclear reactor, and he did at the University of Chicago. In fact, underneath a football stadium, beneath a football stadium at the University of Chicago, there was a huge laboratory linked to the Manhattan Project, part of the Manhattan Project, but we'll talk about how many other areas they chose. They did not choose Albert Einstein, and the question is why not? He was clearly way above all the others in terms of reputation, and of course, um, clearly a man with enormous vision in physics and contributions, obviously. Albert Einstein, many people do not realize that because of his great reputation as the most gifted physicist of the 20th century, was a socialist, by the way, and a pacifist. Albert Einstein had association with socialists and pacifists. And there was concern that this man should not get security clearance. I should point out, by the way, that Robert Oppenheimer was also leaning in that direction. There were many of his associates, including the women in his life, who were, and I'll talk more about him when he was blacklisted in the 50s, in 54. But the fact is that Einstein did not make the cut. All right, he was a socialist, so he was not part of that. A lot of people may assume he was, but now they chose a number of areas where the project was dispersed. Los Alamos, New Mexico was obviously one of the areas where many people worked on this project. Hanford, Washington, in the state of Washington was another. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Chicago, the University of Chicago, where Leo Szilard was. There were many people involved in this project. In fact, a total, if you combine, take it in totality over the years, close to 500,000, according to sources, something like 500,000. This is from secretaries all the way to, Robert Oppenheimer. There are a lot of big names. I don't want to mention all. I will mention. I already mentioned Einstein. I mean, Einstein was a part of it, but I mentioned Leo Szilard, who was part of it, and Robert Oppenheimer. I want to mention two other names. That is Enrico Fermi and Edward Teller. Edward Teller is an interesting figure, by the way, because Edward Teller was the most, let's say, right wing among the scientists working in this project. He was an enthusiast of building the bomb and going ahead and using it without reservations. He's also important because he's known as the father of the hydrogen bomb. the hydrogen bomb, which is 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb. Edward Teller um, is also unfortunately known for not supporting Robert Oppenheimer when he came up on charges against the Senate Hearings Committee during during an investigation about his security clearance in the 1950s, at the zenith of the Cold War, when they were going against individuals that they suspected were a security risk and possibly linked to the communists. We'll talk more about this. The project was very expensive. The total cost in 2023 dollars was 49 billion. It was 49 billion dollars. Enormous amount of money. And the bomb was finally tested. It was successfully tested in New Mexico in July 1945. And the result was that Robert Oppenheimer came away and said that he was stunned by what he saw. He believed when he witnessed the explosion, this mushroom cloud, that this was a weapon that would deliver mass death, destruction. And that's when he quoted the Bhagavad Gita, a Hindu text about Vishnu, I believe, the deity in Hindu religion, the Hindu faith. And he showed clearly skepticism, to put it mildly, about this. The thing is that obviously this was the man in charge. He realized that this is a weapon that would be used against civilians. Now, let me point out, by the way, that there are many scholars, and I agree entirely with them, who believe that all wars from ancient times to the present are wars against civilians primarily. This particular weapon, right, was in fact used on two civilian targets. The decision to drop the bomb has been of enormous controversy, and there is so much written about it. And there is disagreement. There is the official version of the Truman administration, why use the bomb. Why is this so important? Because it sets a precedent on first use. The first use issue remains important to this day. Why go that route? Because once you push the button, if the other side, at that time, of course, nobody had the weapon, but today, like I said, it's important even today. If the other side has a weapon, they're going to push the button. There's going to be an automatic response, actually. So then you have nuclear holocaust. The issue for the Truman administration was very simple. The war in Europe was over because Germany surrendered in March 1945. The war in Asia was not over. Japan had not surrendered. In fact, as the war was dragging on, Joseph Stalin, the leader of Soviet Russia back then, obviously was preparing to enter the war over in Asia. By the way, Russia, like the United States, is an Atlantic and a Pacific power because of the stretch of the territory. It goes from the Atlantic to the Pacific, just like the United States. So The Soviets were thinking of that, and they did it toward the tail end. The Truman administration the president did consult various individuals from within the Department of Defense, State Department, intelligence, of course. And the question was the war winnable in the absence, with conventional weapons, in the absence of using this weapon? Because obviously this would unleash an arms race, because eventually somebody else would get it, and they did. Um, here's the controversy. The official version is that Truman had to drop the bomb officially to save American lives because the Japanese just would not give up. Okay. Um, there is a debate on how many lives would be saved if they went ahead with a conventional war versus using the bomb to end it abruptly as it did it. But let's put that aside. The question has been in scholarly literature, people who have looked at the National Archives of the United States, whatever documents are declassified, because a lot of this stuff, by the way, is classified. When you go to the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, near the University of Maryland out there, what you find is they're not going to give you the files that are the most sensitive. They're still classified. So, but there is enough material that you can put together and you can see that there was a political agenda behind all of this. And the political agenda was, what message would it send to the world if the US did use the bomb? And not just to the world, but how about to the Soviet Union? Although the Soviet Union was an ally of the United States, by the way, except that they were still communists and they were only an ally under emergency circumstances. They had a common enemy, the Axis powers. US and the Soviet Union were buddies, they were friends, they had an excellent working relationship during the war after the Tehran Conference of 1943. But after the war would be over, right? Back to confrontation. Communism, capitalism. There is that element of it, that the decision to drop the bomb was to send a signal to the Soviet Union and to the rest of the world that there is one emerging superpower, the US, which is true, by the way. The US did emerge as the single most significant superpower on the planet because it had monopoly on nuclear weapons, it had the bomb, and it had the resolve to use it. That's the key. So there was, in fact, a decision to target those two cities, civilian targets. There was the pretext that there were some military personnel, of course, but these were civilian targets. And the result was that it was catastrophic. The fact is that more than a third of the population of Hiroshima died, not to say of radioactive illnesses and cancer on the part of the survivors. Many people say, and I'm sure many of you have heard this, that the lucky ones were the ones who died right away, instantly, not those who lingered on. Japan, unfortunately, dragged its feet on surrendering. By the way, I just remembered there is another scholarly version of the Truman decision. Controversial, but I have to share it with you. There had been rumors around the White House, the Truman White House, that Japan was so resentful of the United States. They knew they had lost, by the way, just like Germany knew it had lost long before it was over and Hitler blew his brains out. Um, that it didn't want to surrender to the US. There were rumors that they were going to surrender to the Soviet Union, which had just at the tail end entered this war. That would have been utterly humiliating for the United States. Because, by the way, the agreement between Stalin and Roosevelt, especially after the Tehran conference in Iran in 1943, was that the two theaters of war, the Asian and the European, would be divided, that the Soviet Union would bear the brunt of the responsibility over in Europe, obviously. Right? I mean, Hitler was moving east. And the US would have the Asian theater. By the way, as odd as this may sound, the fact is Asia was much more difficult to manage because the Japanese, as I'm sure some of you may have seen even movies about this, but if you study it actually, if you study the history of World War II in Asia, you'll find they were everywhere. They just dispersed everywhere. Very difficult war to fight for the US in the Pacific. I mean, they were from China to India. They were everywhere in the islands. So the idea that that Japan was going to surrender, there were rumors like to what degree. Obviously, this theory, is you can take it seriously or you cannot. But there is that what if they did surrender to the Soviet Union? The U.S. drops the second bomb in Nagasaki. Equally devastating consequences. The number of dead is estimated around 200,000 or so in both. Um, Obviously, it's a lot higher as soon as, I mean, you have basically people with radioactive. There's radioactivity everywhere in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and the ones who survive suffer from all sorts of diseases, obviously cancer. There is another element to this that's rather disturbing, by the way, and that is the top secret experiments between April 1945, months before Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and July 1947, long after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that are connected to the Manhattan Project. And these were medical experiments conducted on American citizens without their knowledge by the US government. They were injecting them with plutonium and uranium. They were injecting them and a third chemical, I forget the third chemical. They were injecting them with these radioactive um, substances to determine the effects on the human body. Now, to be fair, by the way, the Manhattan Project did have a division, a medical division, and they did experiment on animals. The medical division came back and said, the studies that we have done, the experiments we have done are inconclusive. They used mice, laboratory mice, and so forth. So they went to human beings without ever informing them what they were doing to them. And they chose people from different walks of life, different areas, and so forth. This, obviously, this sort of experiment not the last one that the US government had conducted in secrecy without telling people, medical experiment, was deemed by the US government, Department of Energy, which took over the nuclear energy and nuclear, anything nuclear is under the Department of Energy's supervision. In 1955, they looked into it as though there was any doubt, and that what was happening, and they deemed that it was unethical. Yes, it was unethical. It is, in fact, actually, it was illegal, um, but they deemed it was unethical. So there is that element, the element of conducting experiments on human beings to determine how sick they're going to get. This too was a top secret operation. A year before the Department of Energy um, reached the conclusion that this was an unethical uh, measure to be undertaken, a Senate investigative committee called Robert Oppenheimer to testify. He was there. It was behind closed door. Nobody knows what was said. There have been there have been declassified documents of this school. It lasted, I believe, it lasted 2 weeks. This lasted 2 weeks, and Oppenheimer, at the end of the 2 weeks, was deprived of his national security clearance. Now, Robert Oppenheimer was not openly socialist like Einstein, who wasn't shy about it, and he wasn't shy about associating with communists, by the way, and socialists. He did in Europe and the United States. However, Einstein's status, he transcended his socialist ideology and commitment and his pacifism. I should point out, by the way, that Oppenheimer had met with Einstein on a number of occasions. During the project, they both agreed that Germany must not get the bomb, the US should have the bomb, we can't afford this. So all of it was driven by defeat the Axis, defeat the Axis. This is the good war theory, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. World War II, by the way, is called not World War One. World War II, by the way, is called by some people the good war, the moral war. The Axis were evil. The Axis powers, Germany, Italy, Japan, they had to be defeated, right? Except that not everything on the other side was made up of angels, um, like this stuff here with nuclear weapons. Oppenheimer went to Einstein on occasion and he would talk to him. He had expressed some ideas about what he was doing to him, without revealing anything secret, by the way. Um, After the testing of the bomb, he did tell him, that is, Oppenheimer did tell Einstein that he had some serious reservation. Both Oppenheimer and Einstein essentially became pacifists. Einstein was a pacifist. Oppenheimer became a pacifist and decided one of the reasons he was so heavily inclined toward Hinduism is because he was increasingly ideologically moving in that direction. The other thing is, Oppenheimer was involved with a lot of people who were openly communists or had no qualms about it. However, including people very close to him and the women he associated with. His wife included, by the way. His wife included. Oppenheimer Was found, however, when the documents finally, when the Kennedy administration took a look at the documents. Bobby Kennedy was in the Justice Department. John F. Kennedy, his brother, president. They found that in fact he never violated security clearance. He never betrayed any secrets. This is not to say, by the way, let me interject something, that there was not skepticism about someone inside the Manhattan Project betraying some of the secrets of the Manhattan Project. Let me interject. There was a physicist, his last name, I believe, was Fuchs, who was, in fact, um, according to official documents, passing on secrets to the Soviet Union. Now, when I should also point out here that at the Yalta meeting in March 1945, when Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt were Yalta is a resort town in the Crimea, by the way, which, as people know, Russia has annexed. And part of the reason why this war has been, since 2014 to today, there's been an inimical relationship between Ukraine and Russia. But in any case, back then they met in the Crimea. Roosevelt was sitting next to Stalin. Interestingly enough, he just assumed Stalin had no idea that the US had a Manhattan Project. Stalin knew. Roosevelt was at a disadvantage because Roosevelt did not know that Soviet physicists were also working on the bomb. And some of the key details needed to complete it were missing. Supposedly, they were provided by Fuchs, by a German who was working on the project, German naturalized American citizen, and the bomb I believe, was successfully tested either in July or August, 1949. And what happens once the Soviet Union successfully tests the bomb, we have the official beginning of the nuclear arms race in 1949, in the late summer, early fall of 49. And something else happens that coincides. This is a series of coincidences that obviously accounts for the panic of the United States and the acceleration of the Cold War and the arms race, the nuclear arms race. Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai in China defeat Chiang Kai-shek, who retreats to Taiwan, the island that's controversial today. It's a country. But the Chinese nationalists go to Taiwan, and who were supported by the United States, by the way, the nationalists against Mao. So you have the combination of Stalin testing the bomb successfully, Mao winning in China, and what goes through the minds of leaders like Truman, who was, by the way, he was not Roosevelt, he was very much uncompromising when it came to confrontation with the Soviet Union. There were choices, by the way. There could have been cooperation. There were elements in the US government who were advocating US Soviet cooperation just like that existed during World War II. Truman was not in that camp. The Democratic Party moved to the right on foreign policy. So he then directed Edward Teller to build the bomb, the hydrogen bomb. Oppenheimer was against it. One of the things because it was 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb. One thing that came up at the Senate hearings was, why are you against the hydrogen bomb? We're facing the Soviets. They got the atomic bomb. And Teller testified at that committee, by the way. There were a lot of other scientists who testified supporting Robert Oppenheimer and arguing this is a man of integrity, a man who never betrayed the United States, never betrayed any secrets. Teller was the exception. He said, well, can we trust him? He was opposed to the hydrogen bomb. So they deprived him of his clearance. After that, Robert Oppenheimer became extraordinarily alienated. He retreated. I believe he went to Princeton. He was in New Jersey, and he lived there for the rest of his life. When Kennedy, this is how I started to say a while ago, the Kennedy brothers came in, one president, the other in the Department of Justice. They looked at the file, found out that Oppenheimer was clean. Kennedy invited him to the White House and offered to lift his clearance. Oppenheimer declined. To give you an idea of how disillusioned he was with his country, he declined. In any event, the 1950s was a period when to be a pacifist like Oppenheimer and Einstein was to be a suspect of supporting communism. Imagine, opposing militarism is equated to supporting communism. Right? Why? Because the Truman administration in 1950 launches a top secret policy embodied in a document called National Security Council Document number 68, NSC 68. The Committee on the Presidential, as it would eventually become known, famous during the 1980s, during the Reagan administration, because he brought them back, including Edward Teller. I remember him on television, by the way. The Truman administration launches this massive militarization program, pouring enormous resources on defense, transferring money from social welfare and social development to the military industrial complex. Okay? This was under Truman. Eisenhower continued it, but Eisenhower is the one who was very cautious about it, and before leaving office, he's the one who finally revealed that we have to be very careful about what's happening in this country, because the military industrial complex, which by the way has its origins, to be fair about this, back in the Woodrow Wilson administration period. That is when Woodrow Wilson put together a cabinet to fight the war, to help out the French and the British against the Germans in World War I. Okay, that's the genesis of it. And it just builds, mushrooms to become huge, largely because of nuclear weapons. So there's an arms race now. Okay, there's an arms race. Anyone against it, suspect of being a communist. Blacklisting begins to become policy. A lot of people, from academics to journalists to people in Hollywood, writers, directors, actors. I mentioned Stanley Kubrick, by the way. One of the reasons he was disillusioned with all of this and used blacklisted writers and in others in his motion pictures from England. All right. So you have a situation in the United States of a Cold War climate that is um, that is predicated around anyone opposing the militarism of the United States and the nuclear arms. So this, of course, until the October 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis was over nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union under Nikita Khrushchev back then was very upset that there were new missiles pointed from Turkey, by the way, from Turkey to the Soviet Union. So what did he do? Takes it up on himself to deliver some nuclear weapons to Cuba, 90 miles from Miami, pointed at the US. Now, there are also submarine launched missiles, nuclear warheads, by the way, from the bottom of the sea that can reach land. But the fact is, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought about a new awareness of Armageddon, of the end of the human race. From that climate emerges the nuclear war theory uh, MAD, mutual assured destruction. For the first time, there's a recognition, just pragmatic, realistic recognition that you can't win a nuclear war with the other side having nuclear weapons. It's mutual assured destruction. Bob McNamara, defense secretary, who came out of, I think he was an executive, he was the chief executive officer of Ford, I believe, or GM, one of those two auto companies. Anyway, he recognized it. He knew it. You can't win a war, nuclear war, when the other side has nuclear warheads. It's mutual assured destruction, the MAD theory. Okay. The realization of the MAD theory brings about uh, the um, a movement to try to manage nuclear proliferation. Now, the genesis of preventing other countries from having nuclear weapons is really with the Eisenhower administration. He announced the program as early as 1953 when he came to. Remember, Eisenhower was the general. He was the commanding officer in the European theater of war, by the way, during World War II. So he was a Republican. Comes in 1953 and wins the election 52. Comes to office in 53, and he announces a program called Atoms for Peace. By 1957, Eisenhower was behind the International Atomic Agency, Energy Agency, which was to make sure that nuclear power is used for nuclear energy and civilian purposes, not for military purposes. Now, one could argue, and it has been argued, okay, now that you got your weapons, the Soviets have theirs and the Chinese have theirs, France and the UK have theirs, you want to stop everyone else, you have what you call nuclear deterrence, but you're depriving us from having nuclear deterrence. See, this is how the argument works. You have your nuclear deterrence, but we don't. So we're vulnerable. You can blackmail us, and we can't do anything about it. The fact is, this agency is still in existence. It does do inspections worldwide on everything from power plants, by the way, to nuclear reactor facilities and so forth. And so this came about largely also to placate the public that nuclear energy is not such a bad thing. It's not just for nuclear weapons, there are civilian applications, the economy benefits, there are jobs connected with it. So the old argument that uh, the military industrial complex also produces jobs in the economy, and the economy benefits. Clearly, Wall Street all along supported this, by the way. They had no problem. So the arms race was something that Wall Street, everything from banks to obviously manufacturers, supported this. Now, in the 1980s, in the early 1980s, there were some problems in the early years until Gorbachev announced glasnost and perestroika and the transition of the Soviet Union to an open society. Um, the problems were that the United States was actually thinking of limited nuclear war with tactical nuclear weapons to be used in the European theater. The Europeans became very nervous, understandably so. Even the British, by the way, which are the UK is has nuclear weapons, as does France. So they became very nervous because they figured, okay, the US has never fought a war on its own soil since 1812. We have fought a lot. The Europeans, by the way, have fought a lot of wars on their own soil. One of the reasons for it that they became second class, playing second fiddle, I should say, to the U.S., junior partners to the U.S. Okay, so there was a lot of nervousness in the 1980s. Then comes Gorbachev and wants an agreement on reducing sharply nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union was spending enormous amounts of money, by the way, on nuclear weapons, on defense, period. Enormous amounts of money on defense related aid and economic aid to its satellites from Vietnam to Cuba to Eastern Europe. They got involved in Afghanistan in the 1980s. The US sent in the CIA and defense people to support the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, which of course they came to regret because the Taliban followed, that the US had to invade again to bring them down, only to be defeated. In any event, the price of the nuclear arms race, because I'm up on the hour, by the way, let me give you some statistics and try to wrap this up, has been close to 6 trillion up to 2023. 6 trillion may not sound like a lot of money, roughly 6% of the world GDP right now, but it's a lot of money. That money could have gone to the civilian economy and to social development, economic and social development. It did not. It went to the arms race. What did that do? Except destabilize all countries, especially those that did not have nuclear weapons and feared that the other side with nuclear weapons had a deterrent which they lacked. Okay. However, even countries with nuclear, take the United States. What good does it do when you know that the other side is going to hit back and wipe you out? You're going to wipe them out, they're going to wipe you out. We're back to the MAD theory, mutual assured destruction, annihilation. This is why this is madness. That acronym MAD, mutual assured destruction, is so appropriate. And one of the reasons that the classic Stanley Kubrick film, Dr. Strangelove, hit the nail on the head with satirizing the absurdity of the arms race, the absurdity, the utter absurdity of the arms race. Risking holocaust of humanity, of all humanity, the end of all humanity. The couple of other points I want to make. There are people who argue, these are people who are in favor of nuclear weapons, of course, They're not so expensive. Actually, they're cheaper. Dollar per dollar, they're cheaper than conventional, spending money on conventional weapons. Yeah, except for one thing, that the nuclear arms race stimulated the need to spend more on conventional weapons. And there are today, those of you who have studied, by the way, nuclear weapons and unconventional weapons, you know that there are weapons today that are conventional that are just as powerful and even more so than the first atomic bomb that was used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Okay. So the fact is that the world has been on a race to spend more and more on defense and taking away from the civilian economy. This has been very costly to human development and social development. So this is one issue. The other issue, and I'll end with that, is living with a nightmare that there could be an accident or a deliberate war, going to war, because there are people who are so dogmatic, ideologically um, determined. Back in the Cold War, there was a slogan in the United States: better dead than red. Okay. You prefer death? Suicide? That's it? That's the solution. Death, or yielding to the other side, nothing in between, no compromise, nothing. Well, today, China and Russia, by the way, which are strategic allies, have more nuclear weapons than anyone on the planet. There are 13,000 nuclear warheads. Okay? They have over 6,000. They have roughly 50% of the nuclear warheads. And they have red lines. China and Taiwan and South China Sea, Russia and what Stalin used to call the strategic zone of influence, all those countries around the ring of Russia. In this specific instance, by the way, Ukraine, because of its access to the Black Sea, very important to Russia historically, going back to the Crimean War of the 1850s. Those of you who know a bit of Russian history, they're not going to yield on that. When Vladimir Putin says this is about our existence and our national sovereignty, national security, if you push us to the wall on this, we're not going to yield. We're going to push the button. They will. And the reason is because the alternative to them is to be subjugated like a third world country, like a global south country. And they're not going to do that. So we're back to the mutual assured destruction theory of the early 1960s that Bob McNamara wisely embraced, by the way. And that is that there is no out here. There are many organizations, I want to leave you with this, that are against nuclear weapons and nuclear power, but especially nuclear weapons, all over the world. They're usually made up of physicists or scientists, but all sorts of organizations. There is a long list of organizations throughout the world. This year, one of those in Japan won the Nobel Prize for Peace. So it's not that there is no opposition. On the contrary, most members of the United Nations General Assembly countries are against nuclear proliferation and nuclear weapons. They want them banned. However, the countries that have them are going to hold on to them. And that is the fate on which humanity rests, on those. I want to thank you for listening. Please write comments and ask questions, and I'll be glad to answer them. And I want to invite you to join this channel. This is managed by Asad Ali, my very good friend Asad, who provides educational material on this channel. Thank you again for listening.